Inside a government office, a senior labor minister, a man who had spent his entire career studying economics, co-founding the London School of Economics, sitting in cabinet meetings that decided the fate of the nation, receives the final briefing on what leaving the gold standard will actually mean for Britain's currency, its trade, its empire. He listens, he absorbs it, and then he says something that would be remembered and quietly mocked for the rest of the century. Nobody told us we could do this. That sentence belongs to Sidney Webb, Lord Passfield, one of the most educated men in the British government, admitting on the record that an entire governing class had spent years treating the gold standard as an unbreakable law of nature, not a policy choice, but something closer to gravity, something you didn't question, something you simply obeyed. For over a century, the promise that a British pound could always be exchanged for a fixed, guaranteed amount of gold had made London the undisputed financial capital of the entire world. Every major currency on earth was, in effect, measured against sterling. Every ambitious government, every merchant, every bank on every continent did its business assuming the pound was as solid and permanent as the gold it represented. And then, in a single weekend in September 1931, it simply stopped being true. Not because an enemy army forced Britain's hand, not because a foreign power seized its gold by force, because the empire that had built the modern financial world discovered, all at once, that it could no longer afford to keep the promise it had spent 100 years convincing everyone else to believe in. Part 1. The Empire Built on a Promise. To understand how far Britain fell in 1931, you first have to understand just how completely it had ruled beforehand. For most of the 19th century and into the early 20th, the pound sterling wasn't just Britain's currency. It was, for practical purposes, the world's currency. The classical gold standard, which Britain had operated since 1717 and formalized fully by 1821, fixed the pound to a specific weight of gold, and because London was the center of global trade, shipping, insurance, and banking, most other major economies eventually pegged their own currencies to gold as well, using sterling as the reference point that made the whole system work. This wasn't an accident of economics. It was underwritten by raw imperial scale. The British Empire, at its height, covered roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and population. The city of London, its ancient financial district, became the settlement point for an enormous share of the world's international trade finance, insurance through institutions like Lloyd's, and sovereign lending through merchant banks like the Rothschilds and Barings. If a government anywhere in the world needed to borrow money to build a railway, fight a war, or stabilize its own currency, the City of London was very often where that money came from. The gold standard gave this arrangement its credibility, because pounds could always reliably be converted into gold at a fixed rate. Holding sterling was considered nearly as safe as holding gold itself. Central banks around the world stockpiled pounds as reserves for exactly this reason. It was, in the truest sense of the phrase, as good as gold, and that trust is what let London function as the world's central bank, decades before any single institution officially held that title. Part 2. The War That Cracked the Foundation. The first serious crack in this system opened not gradually, but overnight, in August 1914. When the First World War began, Britain suspended full gold convertibility almost immediately. The pressures of financing a war of unprecedented scale made maintaining strict gold backing effectively impossible. Britain borrowed enormous sums to fund the war effort, and much of that borrowing came from a country that would emerge from the conflict transformed: the United States. Before 1914, the United States had been a debtor nation, borrowing capital from London to fuel its own industrial expansion. By the war's end in 1918, that relationship had completely reversed. America had become the world's largest creditor, and New York's financial markets had grown deep and sophisticated enough to begin rivaling London's for the first time in history. Britain, meanwhile, emerged from the war economically exhausted, its industries battered, its finances strained by war debt, its once unquestioned financial dominance now genuinely, if quietly, in question for the first time in a century. British policymakers faced a defining choice: return to the gold standard as quickly as possible to restore the pre-war credibility that had made London the world's financial center, or accept that the world and Britain's place in it had permanently changed and adjust accordingly. In 1925, Britain chose to try to turn back the clock. Part 3. Churchill's Gamble. On April 28, 1925, Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill announced Britain's return to the gold standard. And not just any return, but a return at Britain's exact pre-war exchange rate, $4.86 to the pound, the same rate that had existed in 1914, before 4 years of war had fundamentally altered the relative strength of the American and British economies. Almost immediately, one of the era's most influential economists, John Maynard Keynes, published a blistering critique titled "The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill." Keynes argued the pound was now overvalued by roughly 10%, a seemingly modest figure that, in practice, made British exports significantly more expensive on international markets while making imports artificially cheap. For an economy that depended heavily on exporting coal, textiles, and steel, that 10% gap was devastating. The human cost showed up quickly. British industry, particularly coal mining, found itself unable to compete internationally at the new, inflated exchange rate. Wage cuts followed, imposed on workers as the only lever available to make British goods competitive again without changing the currency's value. The resulting unrest culminated in the General Strike of 1926, when roughly 1.7 million workers across Britain walked out in solidarity, with coal miners facing exactly these gold standard-driven wage reductions. Unemployment climbed steadily through the rest of the decade, hovering above 10% for years, a level historians now widely attribute, at least in significant part, to Churchill's decision to prioritize pre-war financial prestige over the realities of Britain's post-war economic position. Churchill himself, according to his own later reflections, came to view the decision as one of the greatest regrets of his political career. He hadn't been an economist by training, and had reportedly leaned heavily on advice from the Bank of England and Treasury officials who prioritized restoring London's pre-war financial credibility above nearly everything else. A decision, in Keynes's now famous phrasing, that placed the entire British economy in a monetary straitjacket it would spend the next 6 years struggling to escape. Part 4. The Global Crisis ARRIVS. For a few years, Britain's overvalued currency was a serious but survivable problem. Then, in October 1929, the Wall Street crash triggered a global economic collapse that turned Britain's underlying weakness into an existential crisis. By May 1931, the crisis reached Austria, where Creditanstalt, one of the country's largest banks, collapsed entirely, triggering panic across Central Europe. Bank runs spread rapidly to Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, and most critically for Britain, Germany, where a full-blown banking crisis erupted by July 1931. German banks, desperate to shore up their own reserves, began recalling funds they had deposited in London for decades, a routine practice that suddenly, all at once, turned into a mass withdrawal. Foreign investors and central banks watched Germany's crisis and grew nervous about a different related question. Was British money, pounds sitting in London banks, presumed as safe as gold, actually as safe as everyone had assumed? Through the summer of 1931, more than £200 million were withdrawn from the London market in a matter of weeks, an enormous sum draining the Bank of England's gold and foreign currency reserves at an alarming rate. Britain scrambled for stopgap solutions. The government negotiated emergency loans from the central banks of France and the United States, and later secured a further £80 million from private markets in New York and Paris. But these loans came with a price. French and American lenders insisted on serious government spending cuts as a condition of support, plunging Britain into a bitter domestic political crisis over exactly how, and on whose backs, those cuts should fall. There's a telling, almost darkly comic detail buried in this period. The Dutch central bank governor was reportedly assured by British officials, only days before Britain's eventual departure from gold, that his country's substantial sterling reserves were entirely safe. The Netherlands kept virtually all of its reserves in pounds on that assurance. Within days, those reserves lost a quarter of their value. Part 5. The Mutiny That Tipped the Scale. By August 1931, Britain's minority Labour government, led by Ramsay MacDonald, collapsed under the political weight of the austerity measures foreign lenders were demanding. MacDonald reformed his government as a national government, an unusual coalition spanning Labour, Conservative, and Liberal politicians, specifically to push through the spending cuts the crisis seemed to require. On September 8, 1931, the national government's austerity program went before Parliament. £70 million in spending cuts, including a £13 million reduction to unemployment benefits, and a 10% pay cut applied across the public sector, cabinet ministers, judges, teachers, and the armed forces alike. The Royal Navy's Atlantic Fleet learned about their portion of these cuts almost by accident. Sailors stationed at Invergordon, a naval base in the north of Scotland, read about the pay reductions in newspapers over the weekend of September 12th and 13th, before their own commanding officers had formally briefed them. Because of how the cuts were structured, sailors who had joined the Navy before 1925 faced a pay reduction of up to 25%, not the 10% applied to more recent recruits, a disparity that struck many as blatantly unfair. On the morning of September 15, 1931, sailors aboard several capital ships of the Atlantic Fleet refused to report for duty. It wasn't a violent uprising. Historians describe it more accurately as history's largest industrial-style strike within the Royal Navy. But for 2 tense days, 4 major warships sat immobilized in the Cromarty Firth, unable to sail, while newspapers around the world ran headlines about mutiny in the British fleet. The financial markets reacted with genuine alarm. News of open unrest inside Britain's own military, arriving on top of weeks of banking panic across Europe, convinced foreign investors that Britain's crisis had spiraled entirely out of the government's control. Within days, the final wave of capital flight out of London began, and this time, there would be no stopgap loan large enough to stop it. Part 6. The Weekend Britain Let Go. By the weekend of September 19th and 20th, 1931, the Bank of England's governor informed the government plainly. The country's gold and foreign currency reserves were essentially exhausted. There was, in practical terms, nothing left to defend the pound's value with. On Saturday, September 19th, the British cabinet made its decision. A formal Treasury press notice, issued the following day, announced that the government, after consultation with the Bank of England, had decided it had become necessary to suspend for the time being the legal requirement that the bank sell gold at a fixed price. A bill formalizing the decision was rushed through Parliament in a single sitting on Monday, September 21st, 1931, ending, in one afternoon of legislative procedure, the currency arrangement that had defined British and, by extension, global finance for over a century. The immediate market reaction was severe. The pound's value fell by approximately 25% against gold within weeks of the announcement. For ordinary Britons, imported goods suddenly cost more. For the government, decades of assumed financial credibility evaporated virtually overnight. And Sidney Webb's now notorious remark, "Nobody told us we could do this," became a symbol, fair or not, of just how unthinkable this outcome had seemed to Britain's own governing class right up until the moment it happened. Part 7. The Empire That Never Came Back. What happened next reshaped the global financial order for the rest of the century. Britain's departure from gold set off a chain reaction. Within weeks and months, a number of countries closely tied to British trade and finance, including several Scandinavian nations and members of the British Commonwealth, chose to follow Britain off the gold standard rather than face the same kind of destabilizing capital flight on their own. This loosely aligned group of nations became known as the Sterling Area, or Sterling Bloc, countries that continued pegging their currencies to the pound rather than to gold, a kind of consolation prize sphere of influence for a currency that had just lost its claim to global supremacy. The United States, notably, did not follow immediately. America remained on the gold standard until 1933, when President Franklin Roosevelt, facing the deepening Great Depression, took the dollar off gold domestically as well. Though, unlike Britain, the U.S. would later repeg the dollar to gold at a new, devalued rate as part of the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement, this time with the dollar itself, not the pound, sitting at the center of the new system. That's the detail worth sitting with as this story closes. Economic historians studying the period have found something genuinely counterintuitive. Britain's departure from gold, despite feeling like a national humiliation at the time, actually allowed its economy to begin recovering from the Great Depression earlier and more strongly than countries like the United States and France, which clung to gold for years longer. Freed from the straitjacket Keynes had warned about back in 1925, the Bank of England could finally cut interest rates and pursue policies aimed at domestic recovery, rather than defending an exchange rate the country could no longer afford to defend. But recovering domestically and reclaiming global financial primacy turned out to be two very different things. The trust that had made London the automatic first choice for the world's reserves, loans, and trade settlement, built up over more than a century, didn't simply come back once the immediate crisis passed. By the time the Second World War ended and 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in July 1944 to design the post-war monetary order, it was the American dollar, not the British pound, that was chosen as the system's anchor currency, backed by the gold reserves the United States now held in overwhelming abundance. London's century, as the unquestioned center of world finance, was, by then, unambiguously over.